Prologue. Vice-Chancellor. Principal. Colleagues, friends, students and family. It is a great honour and delight to have been appointed to the Tolkien Professorship of English Literature and Language and to be speaking to you today on the occasion of my inaugural lecture. Before I begin the lecture proper, I want to pay tribute to a few individuals. J.R.R. Tolkien is probably the most famous person to have worked in the Oxford English faculty. His work is particularly relevant to my topic today. Many people begin their journeys into the Middle Ages by reading his books, which often capture people's imaginations for life. And those books are also about journeys. Both The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings are quest narratives. Tolkien's academic work on medieval literature remains influential too. The Monsters and the Critics, not a description of a faculty meeting or a governing body, or the famous essay about Beowulf, is one of his best-known academic essays, and he wrote widely on later medieval literature too. The Tolkien Trust is one of the generous benefactors that endowed this chair. It was also endowed by the legacy of Mrs. Jean Griffiths. The Griffiths family have also been extraordinarily generous to this faculty. John and Jean Griffiths made previous gifts for another chair and a graduate studentship as well. They did this in memory of their son, Jeremy. Jeremy Griffiths was a medievalist who died tragically young in 1997, aged 42. I did not know him, but his work on medieval manuscripts remains central to the field, and I know there are people in the audience today who knew him very well. I quote from Vincent Gillespie's address that he gave at Jeremy's memorial service held at St. John's. There were many aspects to Jeremy's life. In a way, there were many Jeremys. There was the Jeremy, the bon viveur with a taste for Lefroy. Jeremy, the entrepreneurial dealer trying to sell a Viking bucket. Jeremy, the would-be politician and speechwriter. Jeremy, the impulsive and unpredictable romantic. Jeremy, the war correspondent. Jeremy, the sybarite. Jeremy, the lead character in the Cheers-like cast of the Duke of Cambridge Bar in Oxford. Jeremy, the connoisseur and scholar of beautiful things. I wish I had known him, maybe particularly in his Viking bucket seller incarnation. I'd like to thank both the Tolkien Trust and the Griffiths family on behalf of the university and the faculty for their belief in the value of endowing this chair in perpetuity and investing in scholarship and in the humanities. I am the fourth person to hold this chair, and I am lucky enough to have known all the previous Tolkien chairs, extraordinary scholars, everyone. Douglas Gray, the first holder of the chair, died 6 years ago at the age of 87, and I know many of us still miss his intellectually generous presence at our seminars. Paul Strome and Vincent Gillespie, the other holders of the chair, are both here this evening, to my great delight. They both taught me. Paul Strome was my doctoral supervisor and Vincent Gillespie my undergraduate tutor, and they are now both my friends and mentors. I'm still astonished to be following in the footsteps of these three great scholars, and it is the honour of my professional life to hold this chair. And so, holidaying in the Middle Ages. In the later Middle Ages, England was positioned at the edge of a global network of trade and travel that stretched across Europe, North Africa, and Asia. Spices and fabrics from as far afield as Indonesia could be bought in the markets and shops of London. Poets such as Chaucer travelled all over Europe, and others ventured to the Holy Land and beyond. I'm going to be talking today about some of those literal medieval journeys, especially pilgrimages, but also about the metaphorical idea of holidaying in the Middle Ages, of journeys into the past. Many people in different eras, including today, have wanted to holiday in the Middle Ages, seeing the medieval period as a place for escaping contemporary problems. Here are some images of the beautiful medieval pre-Raphaelite images. One of the questions in which I'm interested is, what do we desire from the past, from a holiday into history? What do people want the medieval period to be? And what, conversely, might medieval texts tell us if we try to read them on their own complex terms? This lecture has 6 short parts. I'll talk about real medieval holidays and holy days, and then Chaucer's imagined pilgrimage, before looking at what 20th and 21st century poets and filmmakers took from the Canterbury pilgrimage, exploring the kinds of responses, escapist and otherwise, that it inspired. I'll then look at medieval fantasies of escape and some specific aspects of medieval poetry that might offer us a particular kind of holiday or holy day. Part 1. I'm going to start by thinking about what a medieval holiday might have been and the ways in which it did and did not offer an escape. The meaning of the word holiday was changing in the late Middle Ages. The word was traditionally used to mean Sabbath, holy day, day of rest, and to refer to special days in the Christian calendar. Chaucer writes, "To the parish church, this good wife went on a holiday." And the Gawain poet tells us what he heard on a holiday at a high mass. That poet is also the first person that we know of to refer to the holidays plural, ere the holidays holy were hailed out of town, giving us a sense of a holiday season over Christmas and New Year, depicted in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight as a time of feasting, games, flirting, and general luxurious enjoyment. Another 14th century poet, Langland, warns us that for the slothful man, each day is holiday with him. Charles Orleans writes about holy day and feast. And in early 15th century texts, we hear warnings. Sometimes people used to howl away the holiday, they kept them sacred, but now holiday is turned to gluttony. So there is an emerging tension between the holy day and the holiday, which parallels the tension in pilgrimage between religious journey and fun. Some kinds of holy day explicitly offered an escape from ordinary life. Carnival days, for example, focused on an idea of the world upside down, deliberately inverting norms. In some major churches, for example, a boy bishop would take over for the day on the Feast of the Holy Innocents. Lords of Misrule were elected to preside over Christmas time festivities and the Feast of Fools. Innkeepers might become carnival kings. These holy days offered a structured reversal of norms, an absolute escape that remained completely contained by the normal structures of life that surrounded them. On pilgrimage too, people escaped their ordinary responsibilities, not only because they were away from them, but because their land and heirs were protected in their absence. But medieval travel texts, in fact, remind us in many ways that when we holiday, we cannot escape our prejudices, our language limitations, our bodies. Many travel itineraries and pilgrim guides survive from the Middle Ages and give us fascinating insights into the world of holidaying in the Middle Ages. The medieval Pilgrim's Guide to Santiago, for example, gives travellers detailed instructions about matters such as where to cross rivers or where it's safe to drink the water. It goes into xenophobic detail about the characteristics of local people, and far from encouraging travellers to escape their usual lives, advises them on how to stay within their comfort zones. French travellers are told which door of the church French people usually enter, and given details about the money changers, hotel keepers and merchants that abound on the Street of the French in Santiago de Compostela. They're very much encouraged to stay with their compatriots, not to escape their normal lives. The Manières de Langage guides, somewhat more liberally, help people to communicate across languages and even to make friends. One of the conversations within this language guidebook from the later Middle Ages helpfully explains how you can bond with a fellow guest at an inn by complaining about the fleas and the scabs that you now have. There is also a role play which encourages a traveller to find a friend to travel with them to Canterbury. I'll just read the English translation there. Hello, my friend, I need to go on a pilgrimage to seek St. Thomas of Canterbury. Would you like to go with me? It also offers a neat way, politely, to decline such an invitation. The interlocutor inviting his fellow traveller to look at his leg, which is so inflamed. Gangrenous. The body thus intervenes, reminding the reader of the impossibility of escaping from the embodied self, even on holiday. While going on pilgrimage was arduous, expensive, and sometimes dangerous, it also presented opportunities that were hard to find at home, particularly for women. There's a good example of this in the late medieval poem, The Good Wife Walled a Pilgrimage, in which a mother who is about to set off on a pilgrimage unto the Holy Land gives advice to her daughter on how to behave. She exhorts her daughter, when I am out of the town, look that thou be wise, and run thou not from house to house like an Antony Grease. A Grease is a piglet, and an Antony or Tantony pig is the smallest pig of the litter. In this couplet, she juxtaposes two different modes of female behaviour. She herself can travel thousands of miles, leave her home, journey right across Europe and over to the Holy Land. But her daughter, staying in her community, should not even go from house to house. That kind of local wandering is compared to the behaviour of an uncontained little piglet. But the speaker sees no contradiction in advising her daughter to stay within very narrow confines, while she herself traverses the globe. Pilgrimage, as, in theory at least, religiously motivated teleological travel, offered a way of expanding women's horizons. Male pilgrims did not always welcome this. In a 15th century account of his pilgrimage to Jerusalem, Brother Felix Fabry comments with admiration on the bravery of the old pilgrim women whom he met in Venice, while pointing out that the younger male pilgrims despised them. Certain women, well stricken in years, wealthy matrons, 6 in number, were there together with us, desiring to cross the sea to the holy places. I was astonished at the courage of these old women, who, through old age, were scarcely able to support their own weight, yet forgot their own frailty, and through love for the Holy Land, joined themselves to young knights and underwent the labours of strong men. The proud nobles, however, were not pleased at this, and thought that they would not embark in the ship in which these ladies were to go, considering it a disgrace that they should go to receive the honour of knighthood in company with old women. These aristocratic male pilgrims tried to persuade all the other travellers to refuse to go in the same ship as the old women. But others opposed them, so that ultimately the aggressive men depart, and the women travel on in the same company as Fabry. But he later tells us that on the ships, women pilgrims do not come to the common table, but eat and sleep in their berths, separated from the men, who can move more freely about the ship. Later in his book, Fabry compares their admirable behaviour with the actions of a female pilgrim of whom he disapproves, on the grounds that she is curious, noisy, and, most inappropriately, ran hither and thither incessantly, and was restless. Travel did not allow women wholly to escape the hierarchies and limitations of their usual existence. Medieval pilgrims were often intolerant. Margery Kemp, a 15th century female pilgrim and writer, was ostracised by her fellow pilgrims because, while they wanted to relax and feast together, she, first of all, kept talking about God, and secondly, insisted on being a vegetarian, much to their horror and complaint. Margery found that Muslim guides in the Holy Land were far kinder to her than her compatriots. Real medieval travel offered extraordinary opportunities, but it did not always offer escape from everyday expectations and limitations. Part 2. Many medieval fictional texts are structured by the idea of the journey, whether it is quest or pilgrimage. And those journeys are rarely straightforward and never offer easy escapes. Perhaps the most famous medieval literary journey is the pilgrimage to Canterbury that structures the Canterbury Tales. The first 18-line sentence of the Canterbury Tales is about desire, the desire to travel. So here are Chaucer's opening lines. One that Aprilla with his sure's suitor, the droct of March hath pierced to the rooter, and bathed every vein in switch liqueur, of which virtue engendered is the fleur. One Zephyrus eke, with his sweeter breath inspired hath in every holt and heath the tender crops, and the young sun hath in the ram his half courser on, and smaller fowls mark in melody that slapen all the nict with open yea, so pricketh him nature in her courages, than long and folk to goon on pilgrimages, and palmers for to saken straunge stronds, to ferna halwas couth in sondry lawns, and specially From every shearer's end of Ingerland to Canterbury they wend, the holy blissful martyr for to seeker, that hem hath holpen, one that they will seeker. This dazzling sequence opens with two parallel images of fertility. When April showers pierce the drought of March, the flower is created. When the west wind breathes into the fields, the crops are born, building up to the consequence then. And the consequence is that people longen to goon on pilgrimages. The repeated when structure mirrors the cyclical nature of the seasons and fertility to create an image of inevitable repetition. In springtime, a time of rebirth, both in nature and in religion, as it is also the time of Easter and resurrection, pilgrims want to go to strange strands, and they want to be healed, to start afresh. But in the next sentence, we will move into the world of the Tabard Inn, a world of happenstance, contingency, and possibility in an extraordinary juxtaposition, as this opening statement of timeless inevitability gives way to a vision of chance and human agency. Befell that in that says an honour day in Southwark at the Tabard as he lay. It is an extraordinary moment. The beautiful cycles of the seasons give way to a pub outside the city walls in an area known for prostitution. We're in a mercantile suburb in a specific place on a specific day where a varied, partly criminal group get together to eat, drink, and tell stories. This turns out to be a text that is not about escape or idealism, but is rather about the contemporary moment, its problems and its opportunities, and about a group of flawed individuals who fight and compete with each other and never reach their pilgrimage destination. The goal of the pilgrimage, Canterbury, is overlaid with another more earthly goal, the free meal back at the Tabard Inn that is promised to the best storyteller. Just as the Canterbury pilgrims have varied motivations, so real medieval pilgrims travelled for different reasons. Some for devotional reasons, of course, but others because they were employed and paid to accompany their masters or mistresses. Some people transacted business as part of their journey. Others sought to have fun, including sexual adventures. These were not journeys of escape. The opening of the Canterbury Tales immediately confronts readers with the tensions inherent in the idea of the holy day or the holiday, as well as juxtaposing the ideal and the real, the timeless and the contingent, the inevitable life cycle with the random contingency of individual existence. Across time, poets and other artists have found Chaucer's lines to be enormously generative. His masterly deployment of imagery and the structure of the journey has been reworked in many different historical and artistic contexts, becoming a lens on both past and present. For the next two sections of this lecture, I'm going to look at how some later artists, poets and filmmakers have engaged with the Canterbury Tales, exploring what they were looking for and what they found in Chaucer's text. Most famously, T.S. Eliot begins The Wasteland, his journey through literature, languages and the past, with an inversion of Chaucer's opening. April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. Eliot redirects Chaucer's lines into images of the grave, the language of fertility, breeding, mixing, desire, now interspersed with dead land and memory. These lines open the first section of the poem, The Burial of the Dead. Eliot's poem was written just after the First World War, which fundamentally changed the literal, psychological, and cultural landscape of Europe and many other parts of the world. Chaucer's lines have a different agency and power in the world of the 1920s. They were invoked again in the Second World War. I move now to 1944, in the depths of one of the very darkest times in world history. In 1944, a film called A Canterbury Tale, directed by Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger, was released. And I'm going to show you the first 4 minutes of the film, and you'll hear again that same 18-line sentence. This film is, on one level, a love letter to the English landscape, to English history, and to Chaucer as an embodiment of a beautiful, spiritual image of the nation, an escape into nostalgia and pastoral idealism. As you've seen, it opens with bell ringing and a glimpse of Canterbury Cathedral through the countryside, before cutting to the opening page of the general prologue. The first lines of the Canterbury Tales are read aloud with modern pronunciation and some changes, before we see a map of England with the Pilgrim's Way, an ancient track leading to Canterbury, and a picture of Chaucer's pilgrims. The pilgrims then become real people, as Chaucer's characters are brought to life riding through the countryside in a bucolic image of merry England. The squire sends his falcon into the air, which changes into a Spitfire. Now we're in the world of the 1940s and the Second World War, with soldiers and tanks in the Kentish landscape, and a modern poem is read, telling us that, though little's changed since Chaucer's day, another kind of pilgrim walks the way. And we enter into the extremely strange world of the film. The basic plot is that, and I'm not making this up, the plot is 3 people arrive at a small village near Canterbury. They are a land girl, Alison, who bears the same name as the wife of Bath, a British soldier, Peter Gibbs, who will soon embark on the D-Day landings, and an American soldier, Bob Johnson, on a brief furlough. Soon after they disembark from the train, late at night, Alison is attacked in the dark by a mysterious stranger who seems to be a soldier, who pours glue on her hair and runs off. The 3 all need to get to Canterbury for different reasons, but they also want to solve the mystery of the glue man, who has now attacked 11 girls in the same way. Soon their attention turns to Thomas Culpeper, a man at the heart of the local community, a highly respected and rich man who lives in a manor house, owns a farm, is a magistrate and justice of the peace, and gives lectures about Chaucer, English history, and the Pilgrim's Way. His central obsession is with the long history of the Kentish landscape. All 3 of the new arrivals, particularly Alison, that's Alison and Culpeper there, are drawn to Culpeper and to his understanding of the past and of place. But they realise that he is, in fact, the glue man. On the train to Canterbury, he explains himself. Culpeper knows with an absolute certainty that everyone should be educated about the medieval past and Englishness. But over the years, he has found that no one is interested. He has lectured to empty halls, tried to speak to people in Hyde Park, done everything to make people listen to him. When the soldiers arrived to camp near the village, he was sure that this would be his moment, that this was a miracle, that he was a missionary who could convert them. But no. To his horror, all they were interested in was girls. Going out with girls, dancing with girls, watching movies with girls in them. Culpeper felt that local girls shouldn't be going out with soldiers, and that soldiers should be listening to his lectures. So he came up with a plan. He would dress as a soldier and pour glue on girls' heads so that they would be frightened of going out with soldiers. Then, finally, the soldiers, with nothing else to do, would come to his lectures. He could then tell them all about the Pilgrim's Way. The 3 pilgrim characters, on hearing this, all agree that he meant well. And they agree not to go to the police in the end. Although Alison does suggest that he should simply have asked the girls to the lectures. In Canterbury, miracles happen for all of them. Alison finds out that her fiancé, Geoffrey, is not dead, as she had thought. The American soldier discovers that his girlfriend has not betrayed him. The British soldier, who had trained as an organist but never had the opportunity to play in a church, plays in Canterbury Cathedral for a huge ceremony before D-Day. The gender politics of the film are extraordinary. And the critic Carolyn Dinshaw has explored the queerness of the film and of Culpeper's behaviour. Chaucer history in the past is for men, according to Culpeper, although the film shows that the character who is most interested in what he has to say and in the history of the land is, in fact, Alison. The film is fascinated by ideas of nation and place. It imagines Englishness as fundamentally rural, something that the Londoner Chaucer would have found hard to understand. Indeed, Chaucer was a figure of modernity in his own time. The son of a merchant, himself a customs officer, fascinated by science and new ideas, experimenting with forms, he lived at the heart of change and was energized by it. His world was urban, and it was also, as I've written about extensively, profoundly European and grounded in travel, multilingualism, and exchange. The idea of England promoted in this film, A Canterbury Tale, is anti-cities. London is despised. Indeed, the opening shot does not trace the route of Chaucer's pilgrims from London to Canterbury. Instead, it traces a more rural route from Winchester to Canterbury, a route which does not go near the metropolis. The film is punctuated with beautiful images of wheat fields, forests and rivers, as well as picturesque village houses, happy agricultural village communities, and lingering shots of Canterbury Cathedral. Alison speaks with horror of living in a closed-in urban street as she had to do before the war, and plaintively asks, why should people who love the country have to live in big cities? Throughout the film, going to the movies is disparaged, rather self-defeatingly perhaps, as an activity that takes people away from seeing real life and things that matter. What they should be doing, Culpeper says, is lying on the earth and looking up at the sky. This peaceful rural fantasy is the past that he, along with many other people, desires. Englishness is also defined through cultural differences with Americans. And indeed, one of the functions of films made at this time was to educate American soldiers about life in the UK, to orient them when they came over here. The great stress is placed in the film on the differences between British and American uniforms, for example, and in particular on the importance of tea drinking to the British, which comes up over and over again in the film, as the film makes it clear that drinking coffee first thing in the morning is not acceptable, and that good Americans quickly learn about how much tea goes into a pot. The audience is even told that only tea drinkers, China, Russia, and the UK, have been able to resist the Nazis. It is worth noting that this quintessential British trait is not, of course, a medieval one, but rather is the legacy of different kinds of journeys of much later colonial travels. British identity is, as ever, constructed through encounters, often violent encounters, with other parts of the world, and fantasies of Englishness or Britishness elide the complexities of the past. The film is an uncomfortable experience, though I do hope you're all now going to go and watch it. The viewer is not encouraged to identify fully with Culpeper's agenda and his attacks. But the film does encourage the audience to yearn for an idealized image of the past that cannot be reclaimed or remade. It does, I think, hold up the medieval past as something worth fighting for in the 1940s. Culpeper, and in a different way Alison, both want to holiday in the medieval past. Partly, this is depicted as a desire to commune with landscape, with nature, with the pre-industrial. Different kinds of people fantasize about holidaying in the Middle Ages. There are medieval theme parks today. The Puy de Fou in France advertises that its concept is that visitors forget all about the 21st century. Closer to home, there are jousting competitions at Blenheim. And for many people, Middle-earth represents the Middle Ages, and you can now visit Hobbiton, a tourist attraction in New Zealand. So people really do holiday in idealised versions of the Middle Ages. But there's also a dark side to this. Some far-right groups have weaponised the Middle Ages, imagining it, utterly unhistorically, as a time of white supremacy and dominance, a time of untrammelled patriarchy and violence, often idealising the Vikings or the Crusades. Fascists who try to harness the Middle Ages in this way are not interested in history or literature, but they are, like many others, idealising the Middle Ages according to their own warped ideals. On the other hand, the word medieval is very often used in our culture simply to mean backward, primitive, undesirable, not modern. Once you start listening for it, you frequently hear all kinds of things described as positively medieval, in particular in recent years, the behaviour of fundamentalist Muslims. The idealised Middle Ages and the terrifyingly other Middle Ages come particularly neatly together in the story of the Camelot theme park. This was an English medieval theme park in Lancashire, and it was open from 1983 to 2012. It then closed down amidst declining visitor numbers. However, happily, it briefly reopened last year for a 2-month period as a zombie-themed horror attraction called Carnival Rises. I really hope this is not a metaphor for my field of study. The complexity of the medieval desire to set off on pilgrimage has been picked up and reconfigured in very modern poets' rewritings of Chaucer's opening lines. I'm going to talk about 2 recent examples, each of which engages in a different way with the idea of the medieval journey, placing it in new contexts and juxtaposing the ideal with an understanding of the dark complexities both of the past and of the contemporary world. These are fascinating examples of holidays in the medieval past that do not seek to idealise, but rather take Chaucer's lines as a way of thinking across long historical trajectories. My first modern example comes from Marilyn Nelson's Cachoeira Tales, published in 2005. When April rains had drenched the route of what March headlines had foreseen as drought, I invited my extended family with artificial spontaneity to join me on some kind of pilgrimage. A fellowship gave me the privilege of offering to cover their airfare and several nights in a hotel somewhere. Thinking of a reverse diaspora, I'd planned a pilgrimage to Africa, Zimbabwe, maybe Senegal, someplace sanctified by the Negro soul. The opening couplet ostentatiously mimics Chaucer, but the lines then move away from the language of the tales, except for the repeated references to pilgrimage. Those opening lines, with their focus on contrast, April, March, rain, drought, life, death, also set the tone for the subsequent lines, which continue to circle around paradoxes and juxtapositions, artificial spontaneity, reverse diaspora. The rhyming couplet structure, which itself imitates Chaucer's style, also encapsulates the idea of pairs and contrasts, root, drought, diaspora, Africa. The Cachoeira Tales interrogates the idea of travel, underpinned by the most monstrous and brutal movement of people through abduction into chattel slavery, and overlaying this with contemporary experiences of travel and movement in many manifestations, including as a search for origins, for identity, for community. There are fundamental parallels with the Chaucerian idea that the search for strange strands, foreign shores, can be healing, can help pilgrims one that they were seeker when they were sick. But it also reminds us that travel is often enforced, even deadly. Similarly, the Refugee Tales, an even more recent text, also brings out and amplifies the contrasts in Chaucer's pilgrimage and between medieval and modern journeys. The first volume of Refugee Tales from 2016 draws closely on Chaucer's lines throughout its prologue. There are now several volumes of the Refugee Tales series, each one a collaboration between some of our best-known authors and refugees, who tell stories while walking part of the pilgrimage route. Here is part of the first prologue. Now longen folk to Goon on this pilgrimage, in June, not April, and with the sweet showers far behind us, though with the birds singing and people sleeping with open eye. And what we long for is to hear each other's tales, and to tell them again, as told by some hath holpen, walking. So pricketh him nature, not believing the stories our officials tell. As the young sun rises, woken in their homes, people are picked up and detained routinely and arbitrarily in every holt and heath under the sun, while small fowls mark in melody, and why we walk is to make a spectacle of welcome. These lines oscillate between direct quotation of Chaucer's general prologue, longen folk, sweet showers, open eye, hath holpen, pricketh him nature, young sun in every holt and heath, small fowls mark in melody, and jarring reminders of the reality of the refugee experience today, not believing the stories our officials tell. Woken in their homes, people are picked up and detained. The idea of the desire for movement, the longing to walk, is juxtaposed with reminders about policies that criminalise movement. In the concept of the Refugee Tales project more generally, this focus on movement and liberty is also contrasted with indefinite detention, enforced unlimited staying still. One reading would be simple contrast, Chaucerian idealism juxtaposed with modern refugee experience. But the relationship between past and present is more complex than that. The mixing of Middle English quotation with modern English also draws the reader's attention to history, the history of language change. Perhaps for some, this polyglot reading experience might remind them that the history of the English language is a history first of immigration and subjugation and then of colonising. That English is embedded in other languages, in interactions between peoples, in movements between countries, sometimes violent, sometimes collaborative. These lines end with a clear agenda to make a spectacle of welcome, to tell asylum seekers that they are seen and wanted. And that spectacle of welcome also involves listening. What we long for is to hear each other's tales, just as the Canterbury Tales is a text that is, above all else, about the importance of listening to multiple tales and points of view, placing marginal voices on the same level as voices of authority. The very idea of a text that allows people to speak functions as an escape text in a world of Kafkaesque bureaucracy. Both of these examples bring together a pilgrimage into the past, to English canonical poetry, and the cultural mixing of modernity. Chaucer's French and Italian-inspired text meets the experiences of refugees from all over the world in Refugee Tales, and the forced migrations of slaves and the lives of their descendants in the J.R.R. Tales. A figure at the head of the English canon, but a poet who was in fact living at the heart of global trade systems and was himself a multilingual traveller, is a starting point for different poets to think about the journeys that many people across time have made and have been compelled to make. These poets have holidayed in the Middle Ages to create new understandings of pilgrimage and desire. For a close reader of Chaucer, these texts do not set up an ideal past against a compromised present. Rather, they draw out, expand on, and amplify the complexity of Chaucer's own conflicted pilgrimage text, a text that itself immediately problematizes the seemingly ideal opening. Part 5. The examples of holidays, journeys, pilgrimages, forced migrations, slave transportations that I've been given so far are all examples of travel that either did happen or could have happened. Realistic modes of travel. But when medieval writers fantasized about travel, rather than engaged in the tough realities of actual journeys with their fleas and gangrene, we see a somewhat different picture. If you cast your mind back to the clip from a Canterbury Tale that I showed you, you'll remember the beautiful image of the soaring bird released by the squire. Many medieval thinkers and writers fantasized about flying and about astral travel to the stars, to the spheres, and beyond. For some, this was potential real escape, a real holiday or holy day. Avicenna, the 11th century Muslim philosopher and writer, wrote about the flying man as a central image in his argument about the nature of the soul and the role of the senses. The flying man is suspended, unable to see, and positioned in such a way that his limbs do not touch each other, and the air or void around him is such that he cannot feel it. Cut off from his senses and his physicality, he is nonetheless aware that he has a soul. Avicenna uses the image to affirm a body-soul duality. Flying represents escape from the physical. In Neoplatonic thought, one could go beyond the senses to commune with the divine. In the 12th century Anti-Claudianus, for example, Alain de Lille depicts a chariot whose wheels symbolize arithmetic, music, geometry, and astronomy, pulled by the flying horses of the five senses, driven by reason, which takes intelligence up to heaven. There, intelligence leaves behind nature, the senses, the arts, and reason, to enter the world of theology and seek a soul. In the celestial realm, the senses are abandoned along with education and reason. Not something that this university would advocate. The idea of flight to the stars or the spheres as a separation from bodiliness also animates several separate images in Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy. For instance, Lady Philosophy tells the prisoner that she can fix feathers to his thought so that he can ascend to the stars and abandon earthly things. Up in the heavens, the soul is freed from the body and its needs. Macrobius too writes about the soul being withdrawn from the body and ascending to the celestial realms. The 20th century philosopher of space, Gaston Bachelard, writes beautifully about immensity, describing a feeling that can arise from experiencing the constellations or the forest, the sea, music. He suggests that one feels as if one is in high places, no longer shut up in his weight, the prisoner of his own being. Like the medieval authors just discussed, he suggests that flying to the stars offers an escape from the body, a chance for the soul to be itself, to be liberated. Chaucer read earlier medieval authors such as Boethius and Macrobius in great detail, and then suggested something quite different in his poetry. He repeatedly wrote about flying to the stars, but he ultimately did not suggest that it involved a leaving behind of the body or of the problems of the world, or that this would be desirable. In The House of Fame, his very best poem, the body remains insistently present throughout dreams, astral flights, and supernatural journeys. Poetry remains for Chaucer an endeavour embedded in the world, and the Milky Way leads him back to his own lived experience. Throughout The House of Fame, Chaucer's avatar, Geoffrey, emphasises that he is not freed from his body. When he is seized by a Dantean eagle and carried up to the heavens, the eagle complains about his weight, for example. Unlike so many of his medieval predecessors, he does not imagine leaving his body or the senses behind. The stars are described thus: "See yonder, lo, the galaxy, which men clapeth the Milky Way, for it is white, and some parfait calling it Watling Street." Chaucer's novel translations of Greek and Latin terms, galaxy and Milky Way, are set alongside the deeply familiar Watling Street, a term that compares the galaxy to a street in London and to the road cutting across England from Kent up to the northwest. This demystification also occurs at a linguistic level slightly later in the same passage. And then thotian Marcian and econ anti-Claudian, that sooth was her description of all the heavens region, as far as that ye say the praef, therefore ye can him now believe. Here, multisyllabic rhymes, Latin names, eye-catching new words pile up at the ends of 4 lines, Marcian, anti-Claudian, description, region, to be followed by a couplet of striking simplicity, monosyllables, and comfortingly familiar words, proof, belief. Juxtaposition is one of the cornerstones of Chaucer's art. He uses it in these descriptions of the heavens to separate himself from a philosophical and reverent understanding of the galaxy, bringing his discussion of the stars back to what we can know empirically. What can he prove and believe? And his interest in using space travel as a way of talking about contemporary social, political, and poetic life, rather than about God and the origin of souls. Instead of escaping, he returns back home to the familiar. The flight to the stars brings Chaucer back to the city. In The House of Fame, he ends up in a chaotic, bustling, whirling structure, the House of Rumour, full of gossip, lies, and movement, a place that closely resembles medieval London. Indeed, it is packed full of pilgrims with stories to tell, very like the Tabard Inn itself. This is a very different version of a journey to the stars from those that Chaucer found in Dante or Boethius. The fantasy of escape is not sustained. Chaucer does not suggest that we can get away from the senses, from our bodies, from the world around us, from the muddy complexities of real life. For Chaucer, even the most fantastical holiday takes him back to where he started. I think of Eliot's Little Gidding. We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. Part 6, the last part. The fantasy of escape played out varyingly for medieval thinkers and poets. However, I want to look at one final kind of holiday. Many medieval writers did believe, I think, in the power of literary form to take us out of time, to create a kind of temporal suspension from ordinary life that might itself be a holy day. Art does not exist to replicate reality, to reflect it back to us. Poetry offers a shape to experience, a form to time itself. Medieval poets and thinkers were profoundly concerned with theories of language, form, and time. For St. Augustine, language and time are fundamentally intertwined. God's word is spoken eternally, and by it all things are uttered eternally. It is not the case that what was being said comes to an end, and something else is then said, so that everything is uttered in a succession with a conclusion. But everything is said in the simultaneity of eternity. Humans, in contrast, have fallen into language, have splintered the word through their fall into time, and their understanding is time-bound and limited. Language is inherently a flawed structure, reflecting our own fallen condition. Many medieval writers sought a way to bring different levels of temporal and linguistic understanding together, to indicate the different nature of divine time and understanding. For some, poetry offered a way of rupturing time. In Boethius' Consolation of Philosophy, he alternates prose and poetry. This alternation aestheticizes a philosophy of time. The temporal sequence of prose is torn by the meters which come from out of time and out of the story of the narrative. Lived time is contrasted with a divine perspective as the meter mimics the harmony of God's time. We cannot see time as God does, but Boethius' use of form makes manifest the idea of rupturing earthly understanding, of temporality. 14th century writers such as the Cloud of Unknowing author and Julian of Norwich meditate on the capacity of language to mean in non-semantic, non-referential ways, as words function as mantras, images as generative surfaces. The Cloud author's focus on short words of one syllable reflects his desire to play with the temporal nature of language, to circumvent the inherently time-based nature of sentences. Pearl, a poem written by the anonymous author of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight in the late 14th century, and which has been called the most formally complex poem in English, a poem about the limitations of human language and understanding, is intricately and beautifully constructed. Its formal perfection might seem to mirror divine creation. The poet, however, inserts a flaw. It has 20 stanza groups, each with 5 stanzas, which would make 100 stanzas, except for the fact that one group has an extra verse. The deliberate flaw can be seen as the poet making it clear that he is not attempting to imitate the divine. However, the insertion of the extra stanza means that the poem ends up with 1,212 lines, 1212, a repetition of the most divinely symbolic number in the book of Revelations, a key inspiration for Pearl, in which the city of God is consistently described in terms of 12. The poet has drawn back from suggesting that his poem is in the sphere of the divine, and then tantalizes us by the paradox of his formal choice. This jeweled poem, a poem that itself is about the unapproachableness of the divine, might seem to suggest that poetic form can represent a different mode of being in time. Chaucer, for all his pragmatic focus on the reality of embodied experience and his, I think, unshakable belief that our perspective always remains limited by our position, both literal and metaphorical, created poetic forms that allow the reader to pause time, to escape into a different understanding of time. In Troilus and Crusade, for instance, the time of the narrative is cut into by songs, complaints, and lyrics, some taken from Boethius, in fact, that take us into a temporal dimension outside the narrative time of the poem. More fundamentally, his experiments with stanza form resulted in his creation of the rhyme royal stanza. The stanza, I've highlighted the rhyme there that goes A, B, A, B, B, C, C, an oscillation that freezes time for us. It seems to progress. It pulls us back again, and it often ends in stasis, before starting again, at times in a recursive return, as we see in the example here, where the second stanza begins with a but, opening up the argument again. And the new stanza always returns us to the back and forth of the A, B, A, B. We think we have moved on to the closure of the final couplet, but the new stanza pulls us back to stasis and uncertainty. Each stanza is like another wave on the beach, paralleling each other rather than progressing. The varied way Chaucer uses this stanza form is a dazzling example of what form can do and of the way that literary form plays with time itself. Entering literature or entering the past is not about encountering sameness, showing us ourselves but in slightly different clothes. Nor is it about an escape, a holiday from reality. But it can be a holy day, a pause, a way of thinking about time and being. To holiday in the Middle Ages, we need to think about form as well as content. That is a great challenge. In popular culture, medieval stories are alive and well, but in general, the focus is almost entirely on content, not form. But as T.S. Eliot wrote, only by the form, the pattern, can words or music reach the stillness. The beautiful, strange wonder of medieval poetic forms is the place where we might truly find a holy day, a holiday in the Middle Ages. Thank you.